Today, I want to talk about the real-life lore and mythology that inspired Hazbin Hotel Season 2. This isn't just about the Bible or the related mythologies and commentaries around it, but it's also going to be about the mythologies kept by various secret societies all over the world from ancient times to today, who all claim that their information was passed down to them either by the gods, or in the later Jewish tradition, the fallen angels like Lucifer himself. This is the claim of various groups as far back as the ancient Egyptian royal class 6,000 years ago to the worldwide fraternity known as Freemasonry today. And all of those are painted as connected to the Season 2 antagonist for Hazbin Hotel, Vox. All of this started in episode 1 of this new season, where Vox is talking to Velvet and Valentino about the opportunity to use angelic weaponry against the angels and conquer heaven. This would make Vox and his sidekicks the rulers of heaven, hell, and even the earth, which Vox says over and over again would make him like a god. And as Vox brings this up, we constantly see the electricity shooting from him, making the shape of the V, the shape of the logo for Vox Tech. This is all important symbolism, as when Vox talks about feeling like a god, he says it reminds him of his life on Earth when he was running an important organization that he referred to as a movement. This was a team of people who were seemingly focusing on what Vox is doing in hell, controlling the societies with its most powerful tools. For Vox, he represented the infiltration of television and movies into the culture, where he was able to get Valentino with his adult films and Velvet with her social media to keep people glued to his screens, with the only thing he couldn't control being the radio. What's interesting about this is Vox doesn't just equate this with the physical idea of becoming a god by controlling the known world, but instead Valentino says with some derision that this movement, as Vox calls it, was really a cult. Now, the V that appears every time that Vox mentions becoming a god is a very versatile symbol, but when flipped upside down, it's used to reference a lot of different cultic groups throughout history. The symbol can very obviously look like an Egyptian pyramid, with others using it to reference the Tower of Babel, and the triangle becoming the primary shape of importance even in modern mystery schools like Freemasonry, where its logo is just two tools laid over each other looking like two triangles. Because of this, Vox's logo in the show actually looks like just half the Freemasonry logo, and there's little hints about this throughout the entire show. First off, there's several instances where two V's are overlaid with each other in order to create the intersecting triangles. In particular, this happens when Vox sits on his special throne that he has made, where two V's are coming together to intersect. This gives the impression that Vox saw himself as just one V in hell, but then as he started to conquer heaven, he became the two V's intersecting with each other. Additionally, on Vox's own hat, we have this upside down pyramid looking like a series of Wi-Fi or signal waves coming out from a single dot. This symbol can also be seen upside down on Vox's chest, where it is clearly trying to look like a pyramid. But not just any pyramid, it looks like a series of stacked lines with one dot at the top instead of a triangle. This seems to be an allusion to a symbol found even on our dollar bills here in America, where we have this great pyramid symbol with a separated top piece that has an eye within it. Vox's own logo is built off of his name Vox and his human name Vincent, but with Vox being the leader of the organization or cult in his earthly life, his logo also seems to be a reference to that cult for him. This is why Vox radiates the V symbol when talking to the group about how becoming a god reminds him of what he did on Earth. Now, in Esoterica, the two overlapping triangles, including those used in the logo for Freemasonry, are said to represent the heaven from above coming below and the earth from below coming up to heaven, with the two merging and meeting in the middle. And while this seems like it may be a very positive thing on the surface, with humans wanting to reach out to heaven and be one with God spiritually, it also has a lot of negative associations throughout history, even in the Bible. With Vox's V logo, we get the idea of heaven falling, his ultimate goal being less about ascension and more about bringing everyone else down if he can't achieve that. We saw this at the end of the season, where even at the risk of his own death and the other V's, he's willing to blow everything up in order to make himself feel important to history. Vox even claims this movement in hell to be an extension of the movement started by Lilith. And while that was something he said in the show for the sake of propaganda and to unite her followers in his movement, it does hint at the real-life claim of these different cultic groups, who claim to have information passed down from them from the fallen angels like Lilith's husband Lucifer, and even from the fruit of forbidden knowledge itself. This is the case with Freemasonry, who claims to have either recreated or inherited the traditions of ancient Babylon, Egypt, and other important biblical figures. So let's take this story from the very beginning and go through the world's mythologies, talking about how these traditions moved from the figure we today call Lucifer down to Adam and Eve, into their descendants, and to the Freemasons and other groups that Vox is alluding to. Part 1. The Givers of Forbidden Knowledge, Lucifer and Lilith. Now, the root of this entire discussion is the idea of forbidden knowledge, supposedly passed down from different secret societies, represented in the show and in the Bible with the fruit of forbidden knowledge in the Garden of Eden. The giving of the forbidden fruit of knowledge to Adam and Eve is the mysterious historical event that was said to change the trajectory of human existence and shape it into what it is today. In the Bible, the story is rather simple. First, God creates Adam out of the dust of the earth to make him work in the Garden of Eden, meaning paradise. Later, to stop Adam from being lonely, a woman is made from his side who we call Eve. The only rule the two of them had was to not eat from the tree of the fruit of forbidden knowledge, as God claims that if they eat of it, it will kill them. But the serpent claims that doing so will actually make them like gods. As punishment, Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden and forced to live in the flawed world we have around us today, and the serpent had its arms and legs removed so that it would slither upon its earth as snakes do now. Now, Hazbin Hotel adapts this basic story, but adds a few key twists. First, and more commonly known, the serpent is replaced by the fallen angel named Lucifer. Second, Adam is explained in the show as having a wife even before Eve named Lilith, created from the same dust as him instead of from his side the way Eve was. Lucifer ends up marrying Lilith when she flees the Garden of Eden for refusing to submit to Adam, and together they sneak back into the garden to give Adam and Eve the fruit of forbidden knowledge. But why did Hazbin Hotel add these changes? Well, the Bible is a series of mythic tales that record real history, but they also encode the real story in symbols, with the symbols changing from one story to the next while still representing the same characters. The story of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, thus, isn't just one story that happened at the beginning of time, but rather it's the same story happening over and over again. And thus, the serpent has a few obvious exact counterparts in other stories in and outside of the Bible, and even outside of Judaism. The most common story that people equate the Garden of Eden narrative with is of course the Book of Enoch, a later text written after the compilation of the Old Testament in the later language of Aramaic instead of the early Hebrew of the Bible. This book retells the story of the world before the flood, with the added narrative of how fallen angels corrupted humans, and it became wildly popular in Judaism and even outside cultures in the centuries before Christianity. In the Book of Enoch, we get the same story of the Garden of Eden but with different symbols. Instead of Adam, which means man, representing all of humanity, with Eve representing all women, the Book of Enoch explains how men and women all over the world fell victim to beings who came from the heavens, known as the sons of God. These are the figures we today call the fallen angels, beings who came to the earth to watch over humans, but who also corrupted them. Just as Adam becomes multiple men and Eve becomes multiple women, the serpent doesn't become just one angel, but rather the Book of Enoch actually names many different angels who each give different forbidden knowledges to humans. These fallen angels are generally represented by a leader, and that leader's name can change from one story to the next. In the Book of Enoch, his name is Shem-Yaza, but his most well-known names in Judaism are Ha-Satan, meaning the Satan or the adversary, as well as Samael, which translates as blind god, as well as venom of God, once again connecting this figure with the serpent. Already, you can see how the story of Hazbin Hotel really just merges these two different versions of the same story, making Lucifer an angel who enters Eden in the form of a serpent. This is not an invention of Ivzy Pop's either, but the Jewish tradition has a multitude of well-known texts that you can read for yourself that say the same thing. Here we have, for instance, the 13th century Zohar, a commentary on the original Torah which does its best to connect the different stories thematically. In an excerpt about the Garden of Eden, Satan is referred to specifically as Samael, and as Samael, he is said to ride the serpent when entering the Garden of Eden to trick Adam and Eve. This makes Samael the equivalent to what we call Lucifer in the Christian tradition, as well as equating him with the figure that we call Satan, who in the show is in fact a different character seen in Hell of a Boss. What's more is the Zohar is also one of the earliest texts to write down the tradition of Samael being married to Lilith, making this Samael once again a very clear parallel to Lucifer in the show. Hazbin Hotel thus isn't really a new story, but a retelling of the Jewish Kabbalistic or received tradition, as it's called, at least for this part of the story. The only real difference is, of course, they replaced the Jewish name Samael with the Christian Lucifer, which Western audiences are much more familiar with. Lilith, meanwhile, has her first written story a few centuries later in a text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. Before this, Lilith was mostly just an oral tradition, where the name Lilith was used to describe a series of demons who would haunt pregnant women and their newborn children. There is no Lilith in the Bible as the first wife of Adam, and there's really no room for it in the story if you read it correctly. But instead, the idea that Lilith was some sort of spirit who lost her children and thus began haunting mothers eventually led to the idea that she could have been the first ever mother who lost the ability to be the mother to the human race and thus began haunting them as a whole. Just as in Hazbin Hotel, the alphabet of Ben Sira shows that Lilith saw herself as an equal to Adam because the two of them were made from the same dust of the earth. It's because of this that she doesn't want to submit to Adam sexually and wants to be the partner who is on top, so to speak. This seems to help inspire the themes in the show, where Adam and Lilith are both presented as the first of their gender in a negative way, with Adam representing toxic masculinity at its rawest, and Lilith hinted at representing toxic femininity. After fleeing from the Garden of Eden, God sends an angel to tell Lilith that if she doesn't return, God will kill large amounts of her demonic children every single day, which itself might have helped inspire the annual extermination that we see in Hazbin Hotel. It's because of centuries-old texts like these that we have the common conceptions today of Lilith being the first wife of Adam, before running off to marry the serpent or a fallen angel. But Vivziepop cuts a little closer to the core of the story with her presentation of it. The real question, however, is what is the secret forbidden knowledge that they gave to humans, and how did it get passed down to secret societies like the ones run by Vox in the modern era? Part 2, the Fruit of Forbidden Knowledge. First and foremost, it's important to know that forbidden knowledge is meant to be a vague symbol that you can attach a lot of different meanings to. The idea is that what humans got more than anything was an understanding of the basic principles of how to exploit any knowledge that you get. And while that knowledge can be exploited in positive ways in order to help other humans, it can also be used in negative ways, making it forbidden. In the Book of Enoch, forbidden knowledge includes knowledge on how to write, on how to use certain plants, and even the art of metalsmithing. These were arts that were considered a blessing in many cultures because they led to us recording information, to creating medicine, and in metalsmithing, the tools that led to great architectural feats in the ancient world and to today. The problem is that those knowledges could also corrupt. With the art of metalsmithing in particular, we didn't just make tools for construction, but also weapons for destruction, specifically the destruction of other humans with war and bloodshed. This is what led to the world before the flood being sinful, and the Old Testament God choosing to send a flood to start humanity over. However, in the Garden of Eden narrative, the fruit of forbidden knowledge is claimed to do two things. One, it leads to death according to the Old Testament God, and two, it makes you like gods according to the serpent. These seem like contradictory things because we think of these figures as being on opposite sides, but both statements can actually be true based on what we tend to think about gods and angels. You see, in Judaism, the serpent is often accused of being a liar, but in the more nuanced portrayal of him, he's presented as more of a misleader, using the truth but phrasing things differently than God does to give a different implication. What this means is that the Old Testament gods claim that eating the fruit would kill you, and the serpent's claim, or Lucifer's claim, that it would make you like gods are one and the same. And that makes sense with our general understanding of the spiritual world, that if you were to become like a god, you would generally imagine yourself as having died in your current form, leaving the flesh to become a greater spiritual being. It's because of this that all of the different types of forbidden knowledge we discussed is said in Judaism to stem from one piece of forbidden knowledge in particular. The knowledge of how to put an end to your reincarnation cycle and instead rise up to become what we think of as an angel or even a god. But how is this actually possible, and how would this information be passed down by a secret society? In Judaism, the Tree of Forbidden Knowledge of Good and Evil isn't just a symbol in the Garden of Eden narrative, but also a framework through which humans are meant to talk to the spirits above. The earliest known writings on this concept come from the early centuries of the Christian era, with the text known as the Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Creation. In this text, Jewish initiates are taught how to pray using the Hebrew letter system in order to connect with the angels above them, who themselves can connect further upward eventually to the one true God. However, in the Kabbalistic tradition, the Tree of Life just refers to the concept of the tree being wholly united to connect to God. To do that, all evil has to be removed, and until that time, it is what they call the Tree of Forbidden Knowledge of Good and Evil. This is something that exists not just in Judaism, but in the Jewish Zohar, for instance. It's explained that figures like Joseph, the first son of Israel, actually learned how to connect to the Egyptian side of the Tree of Good and Evil during his time working for the Pharaoh in Egypt. While Judaism primarily uses its meditative system called the Tree of Life, however, most other cultures had an initiation-based ritual system designed to connect them with their ancestors. So let's explore exactly what that ritual was and how it supposedly connected you with the gods or your ancestor spirits. Now, this initiation system didn't just exist in Egypt and actually existed all over the ancient world and continues today into Freemasonry, as we said. But back in ancient Egypt, this ritual was performed only for the pharaohs, and to connect the pharaohs to the ancestor spirits, they had to undergo a symbolic death and resurrection. Here, the initiate played the role of the Egyptian god Osiris, who was tricked by his brother Set and then killed. Osiris is momentarily resurrected, but only long enough to impregnate his wife with their son Horus, who would go on to defeat Set and reclaim the throne of Egypt. Osiris, meanwhile, because of his momentary resurrection, ascends to become the god of the afterlife. Now, in ancient Egypt, the story is played out with the great ancestor spirit Osiris, who is said to be the founder of Egypt and the ancestor of the pharaohs. But in smaller cultures that didn't have a long line of royalty, these ancestor spirits aren't treated as massive gods, but smaller spirits that simply watch over the tribe. But they still make use of the same death and resurrection ritual. By doing this ritual, the pharaohs were said to stop reincarnating on Earth and instead join Osiris in the afterlife, where they become a judge of the dead. This matches the definition of the Tree of Forbidden Knowledge of good and evil, something that stops you from being on the earth, meaning you die, but also makes you, like gods, being a spiritual entity above. Already, you can see how this plays into the cult that Vox was said to be a part of, a group that he associated with the concept of becoming a god in the afterlife now that he is there. And Egypt is just one of the 70 nations descended from Noah said to be misled by the fallen angels who are communicated with through this system, leading to the ancient Egyptians getting the knowledge of writing, agriculture, and even architecture that they associate with Osiris and other knowledge-giving gods. In Greece, they had the Dionysus mystery cult, which performed a similar ritual with the death and later spiritual ascension of Dionysus. In Greece, the mystery systems were so popular that they also had the more well-known Eleusinian mysteries, where you played the goddess Persephone falling into the underworld with Hades before being restored to the heavens thanks to her mother. In this system, to simulate a real near-death experience, you were even required to run 20 miles before seeing this play, leading to a rush of bodily reactions that simulate a momentary death in the brain. In Babylon, the same basic story played out again with the goddess Ishtar descending into the underworld before being restored above, and even in the Nordic lands, they are said to have the story of Balder being killed and then having to resurrect himself. The point is that this tradition had spread out all over the ancient world, but who was it supposedly passed down to today? Well, in the polytheistic traditions like Judaism and Christianity, the other gods of ancient pantheons aren't erased or forgotten, but treated as lower angels who have misled the world into worshipping them. The gods like Osiris in ancient Egypt, thus, become the fallen angels in the Book of Enoch discussed earlier. In the Kabbalistic tradition, this would equate Osiris and the gods of other nations with figures like Samael or our Lucifer and his wife Lilith, who gave forbidden knowledge to humans. And after giving that knowledge to Adam and Eve, it would pass on to none other than their children, Cain and Abel, with Abel, of course, being a pretty important character in the show starting in Season 2. Part 3, Cain and Abel. In Hazbin Hotel, Season 2 introduced us to the character of Abel, the second son of Adam. But it didn't do anything to explicitly address Abel's biblical backstory, the way it had with a retelling of Adam and Eve's back in Season 1. All we really know is that Adam really hated Abel because he wasn't toxic enough for him, basically. But his entire characterization in that regard is just a very complex joke about the real story of Cain and Abel, which of course is going to connect to the fruit of forbidden knowledge. Now, in the Bible, Adam and Eve have 2 children when they first leave the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel. The same way that Adam represented early man and Eve represented early woman, however, Cain and Abel were not just 2 brothers, but they represented 2 different types of people that coexisted. Cain was a tiller of the earth, meaning a farmer, and Abel, meanwhile, was a shepherd. With that in mind, Cain represented civilizations that were known for farming and growing to massive sizes because of it, whereas Abel represented the cultures that had maintained the tradition of traveling with flocks of animals. To do that, you have to support yourself by keeping your size rather small, not just living off of the animals that you can take care of, but also off of the land that they feast off of, and allowing your flock or you to grow too big will eventually lead to overeating and thus starvation. Whereas by reshaping the world to your will as a farmer, you're able to grow as much food as you need every year, still leading to some starvation when crops die or there's some sort of famine, but generally allowing you to keep expanding and to make your civilization bigger and bigger. In the Bible, Cain and Abel both bring sacrifices to God, but Cain sees Abel as having more blessings and becomes jealous. Because of this, Cain kills Abel, leading to God punishing Cain to be a wanderer of the earth. Despite this, Cain would go on to found the first major city because of course he was also the first ever farmer, allowing his people to become much bigger because of this particular knowledge. Cain's descendants as a whole, despite their curse to wander, are described as being large peoples who bring great accomplishments to the world with different forms of knowledge. This includes descendants like Jubal, who was said to bring the art of music, and Tuval-Cain, meaning to come from Cain, who was said to create the art of metalsmithing. Already, you can see how the story shares similarities with the Garden of Eden narrative and the story of Enoch, but it goes even deeper than this. In the Book of Enoch, we were told that the fallen angels didn't just give humans knowledge, but specifically, the angels were said to give this knowledge to their half-human offspring after taking human wives. This is based on the story of Noah's Ark and the actual Book of Genesis in the Bible, where the sons of God were said to take those human wives, leading to the birth of giants known as Nephilim. The Nephilim thus just become a new symbol for the people of Cain. People who weren't physically giant themselves, but who just built giant cities and were said to give the gifts of knowledge to the world that the fallen angels were said to share. The art of metalsmithing from Tuval Cain is the most important of these, as it hints at the creation of weapons, just as Azazel taught in Enoch, which itself plays into the idea that Cain murdered Abel. Despite the accomplishments of this line, even other descendants of Cain are shown to be murderers as well, however, such as Tuval Cain's own father, Lamech, who kills a young man. And this leads to the very interesting possibility in Hazbin Hotel. Specifically, is it possible that the reason we haven't seen Cain yet is because he is very clearly not the son of Adam and Eve, but the son of Lucifer and Eve? You see, in Judaism, the similarities between the Nephilim and the line of Cain are so apparent that in texts like the previously discussed Zohar, Cain is said not to be the son of Adam and Eve, but the son of Samael and Eve, with Samael again being the Jewish equivalent to Lucifer. According to the Zohar, Samael rode the serpent not just to give forbidden knowledge to Adam and Eve, but to seduce her and defile her. This is something Lucifer seems to allude to in Season 1 of Hazbin Hotel, when he is fighting with Adam in the finale. In this scene, Lucifer talks about how both of his wives, meaning Lilith and then Eve, liked what he had to give them, with Lucifer making a sexual thrusting motion. Here's the clip so you can see how obvious it is for yourself.
Well, your first wife didn't seem to hate what I had to offer. For the second.
It seems to be saying that Lucifer didn't just marry Lilith and have a child with her, but that Lucifer also seduced Eve. With that in mind, Cain may not be the actual son of Adam in Hazbin Hotel, but also Adam may not realize this. The show makes it clear that Adam hates Abel, and that would make it seem like Cain is his favorite, with Cain's character of a killer being more in line with what Adam is in the show. Though it should be noted that whether or not Cain really is Adam's son in the Helliverse, hating Abel doesn't necessarily mean he has to like Cain, as even in the Bible, Adam and Eve are recorded as having a third son, who was the ancestor eventually leading down to Noah. As of now, the big theories in the show for Cain is that Cain is either in hell and became the first founder of the first city in hell instead of the first founder of the first city on earth, possibly making him one of the oldest figures in hell, and in particular, the Pride Ring and Pentagram City. With the other top theory that people seem to be floating around being that Cain never actually died because God gave him a special mark in the Bible to protect him from people who were trying to hurt him. While this isn't said to make him immortal, there are some traditions that hold that Cain cannot die at all, not just from murder, but even from old age, making him someone who still wanders the earth to this day. Regardless of the truth in real life or in the show, what we're trying to get to here, however, is the story of the forbidden fruit of knowledge and what that has to do with Cain and Abel. We've already discussed how, in the show, Vox's story and symbolism allude to Freemasonry and the fringe theory accusations against them. While a lot of Freemasonry's ritual is built around secrets, they do have public documents available for the founding of their craft. Generally, Masonry claims to hail back from many different traditions, and in a way, they are all true, as it's a tradition that has been around the world cultures. Instead of being a direct continuation of any particular mystery school like the ancient Egyptians or the Greeks, however, Masonry more so presents itself as modeling their system after the well-known aspects of all of the mystery schools and secret societies that came before them. Among the earliest of the public documents that we will explore in today's video is the founding poem and charges of Freemasonry, which date to long before its legal debut in the 1700s as a charity-based fraternity. All of these are available in public text today, compiled by Freemasons like Albert Mackey in his work, The History of Freemasonry, which itself relies on largely public documents, including some donated to museums that can be viewed there today. One of the oldest of these documents is called the Dowland Manuscript, and features an exaggerated origin of the story of Freemasonry, which is a fraternity built around the themes of architecture. With that in mind, the Dowland Manuscript explicitly claims that the origins of its knowledge on building come from the four descendants of Cain, Jabal, Jubal, Tubal Cain, and his sister Nama. From these four, the arts like music, building, metalsmithing, and the womanly arts like weaving were said to be born. Cain's descendants were said to die in the Great Flood, however, with only Noah and his descendants surviving. So how did this information get passed on down to Freemasonry? Well, according to the Cook manuscript, Cain's descendants knew that their gifts of knowledge would bring about a great flood. In order to preserve their teachings thus, the descendants of Cain were said to carve their secrets into two pillars made of marble and stone, one designed to survive in the case of the world dying in fire, and the other meant to survive in the case of the earth dying in a flood. The descendants of Noah were said to later find this information, with it infecting some branches of Noah's descendants more than others. Two of these descendants are alluded to in Hazbin Hotel through Vox's logo. On the surface, it's simply a V, but if you flip it upside down, it of course becomes more of an a reference found throughout esoterica media and Freemasonry. You see the symbol being used even more so when you wrap a circle around it, as is sometimes the case with the Vox-Tech logo with a circle around the V. This is due to the two tools featured in the Masonic logo, the compass, which makes a perfect circle, and the square, which is used to make the perfect sides of the A, allowing for a circle and an A, or an upside down V in this case. This A or triangle itself is important because when facing upwards, it's a clear reference to the buildings of the ancient societies said to get their knowledge from the gods. This includes the epic antagonists of the Old Testament, which include Egypt and Babylon. With Egypt, the triangle is an obvious reference to their Great Pyramids, but this same basic structure was also used for important buildings in cultures like Babylon, where they have the Babylonian ziggurat. This pyramid-like structure is also referenced a lot using the A or triangle, especially in esoteric media. Most of you are familiar with Atlantis, for instance, where the title even has the stylized triangles in place of the letter A. In the movie, this is meant to be a reference to the Tower of Babel in the Bible, which is generally depicted as looking like that Babylonian ziggurat. I bring this up because a lot of people who watch my videos when I bring up references to Freemasonry, especially when it comes to Vox, are saying I might be overreading the symbols here, but it really is more common than you think, even being in mainstream Disney movies like the Atlantis film. The point is that these civilizations were said in the greater esoteric tradition to have knowledge passed down to them first from fallen angels, and then from mysterious architecture left behind by the civilizations that first made contact with them, allowing for cultures like Egypt, Babylon, and others to eventually recreate the initiation systems and get back in contact with the angels. And according to the charges of Freemasonry and its other symbols, it's Egypt, Babylon, and the two pillars from the world before the flood that came from Cain that their information supposedly comes from. After first attaining this knowledge, this would lead to the nations coming together under the rule of Nimrod of Babylon to create what we call the Tower of Babel. This wasn't just a great building, but it was a building so big it was attempting to reach to the heavens so that humans can be with the gods. Once again alluding to what the serpent said back in the Garden of Eden narrative, of using the fruit of forbidden knowledge in order to get information that will make you like gods. Vox's buildings are meant to look lightly ziggurat themed, with it looking even more obvious with the doomsday device he designed literally to penetrate the heavens and help him conquer it. It's not that Vivzy Pop is just retelling the story of the Tower of Babel, but rather with a TV-headed demon Vox, she's explaining how that same thing is happening again today in real life. Instead of great buildings this time, the conquering of the world comes not from physical dominance and big structures, but from a network that allows you to control what people think, just as Vox does with his TVs. And with Vox, you also get the reminder that he's doing this out of corruption, not good intention. Vox and his 3 Vs are essentially like angels who bring in new forms of forbidden knowledge. Knowledge that could be used for good, but which, like metalsmithing being used to create weapons, can also be used for evil. This makes sense as the idea of these secret societies giving forbidden knowledge isn't just something in the ancient past, but also something we see today with Freemasonry. In more modern times, Freemasonry wasn't just a club that housed members like the Founding Fathers of America, but one of its most well-known members in particular was none other than Benjamin Franklin, who after doing this initiation ceremony supposedly linked to the Egyptian ceremony that is supposed to connect you with ancestor angels that teach you forbidden knowledge, went on to be the man who discovered electricity, bringing this new type of forbidden knowledge to the world today that has changed everything. When accused of being an occult, however, Vox shrugs off Valentino's accusation, mostly because he doesn't believe in the spiritual aspect of what this organization taught. What resonated with him were the ideas of control, and at the time of his life, he couldn't imagine there being a spiritual component to his teachings that would carry over after his death. With Season 2's focus on the mystery initiation system, it makes sense that they also introduce the character, the Speaker of God, who has a strong connection to all of this, and even to the Cain and Abel story yet again. Part 4, The Speaker of God. In Hazbin Hotel Season 2, we were introduced to the new character, the Speaker of God, but unfortunately, after a big appearance in the second episode, we didn't end up seeing her again. Of course, most fans expect her character to return in Seasons 3 and 4 with more purpose, but we can already begin to see what that might be with the real-life lore of the Speaker of God. The speaker of God, as her name suggests, claims to speak for God, but with God in this world having very little advice that he actually wants to give. Instead of handing out orders through the speaker of God, the speaker is able to step in at appropriate times in order to diffuse situations. But elsewise, creation is left to be run by Sarah. Because of this, Sarah, Lucifer, and all the characters in Hazbin Hotel are actually able to make mistakes, even if they thought God would guide them against it. This is the case with Sarah especially, who didn't want to start the annual extermination of the sinners, but felt like she had to in order to protect heaven. If she had known that the sinners could be redeemed, she would not have allowed for the extermination, and in fact, she probably would have worked really hard to help sinners get into heaven. But if God, and thus the speaker of God, knew this was possible, why didn't they bother to tell Sarah? And even afterwards, why did they leave Sarah with the burden of trying to understand why they didn't do this? Now, there are a lot of theories on this subject, ranging from people thinking the speaker of God doesn't actually speak for God at all, to God needing humans and angels to reach certain conclusions on their own for whatever reason. This is essentially the answer that the speaker gives to Sarah when she asks why this was allowed to happen, with the speaker emphasizing that certain answers can only be appreciated through you coming to understand why the answers exist, instead of simply having the answer handed to you. But as I explained, there are a lot of theories that this figure isn't all that they say they are, and this is due to the fact that in real-life esoterica, the speaker of God is generally shown to be a flawed being, and like humans, they need to be shown how to become better by making their own mistakes and then seeing the consequences. In the different mythologies around the world, there's actually a general consensus for who the most powerful god is in all of the pantheons. In Judaism, the claim is that there is one true god above all the others, such as we see in Psalm 82, where we get the story of God standing among other gods and judging them for how they misled the world and favored the wicked. However, in Judaism, the one true god cannot interact directly with the world either, and because of that, an angel has to be placed in charge of the world who is supposed to carry out God's will. This is what we would call the speaker of God in Hazbin Hotel, but in Judaism, this figure is known as Metatron. This is believed to be a code name translating as beside the throne to indicate that this angel works with God instead of being God himself sitting on the one true throne. This makes sense as a translation when you look at the other names this figure has in the greater Jewish tradition. In the book of Exodus within the Bible, for instance, this angel is said to be placed as a guide over the Israelites on their way out of Egypt. In this passage, God says to the Israelites that this angel must be obeyed because the angel has God's name within it, which is a very important detail. You see, in the Bible, God is often referred to by his personal name written with the letters YHWH, often pronounced today as Yahweh. But since the angel has the one true God's name within him, he is often referred to in the text as the lesser Yahweh as well. It's because of this that later Jewish Kabbalists such as Recanati explain that sometimes the name Yahweh refers to the one true God, but other times it can be used to refer to that intermediary angel. This can mislead people into thinking that some actions that Metatron or the lesser Yahweh did were the actions of the one true God or vice versa. It's because of this that later Jewish texts like the third book of Enoch depict Metatron as being punished by the one true God for allowing a human to walk into the heavens and think that there were actually two gods instead of just one. However, I said earlier that the different religions all seem to agree on who this figure is in the greater pantheon. And what's interesting is that in the other religions outside of Judaism with its monotheism, we find that this angel is none other than the thunder god that we generally know as Zeus in the Greek mythology. In the Greek pantheon, Zeus is the most powerful god, but that doesn't make him the most loved or beloved god by the Greek people. Zeus worship itself actually came in from inland outside of Greece, with the original peoples of the Greek land actually worshipping the god Poseidon before Zeus became more powerful. This is all important because Zeus shares a lot of crazy similarities with the Old Testament god, or as later writings will claim, the figure Metatron using the same name as the one true god. In the Garden of Eden narrative, we get the story of the Yahweh, or perhaps the lesser Yahweh now, trying to hide certain knowledge away from humans and forbidding them from understanding it, leading to the serpent giving them this knowledge against the Yahweh's wishes. In Greece, we have the same story with Zeus, who wants to keep the knowledge of unwearying fire away from humans, with the Greek god Prometheus coming in to steal that knowledge and then giving it to the humans against Zeus's will. Later in the book of Genesis, we also have the story of this Yahweh figure sending a great flood in order to wipe out humanity. And in the Greek tradition, this is also done by none other than Zeus, with the only human being saved in this case actually being the son of Prometheus, who he warns of the great flood so that he can build a great ark and save his family. So what you have in the Old Testament is this Yahweh figure being claimed to be the god that sends the Great Flood and tries to keep forbidden knowledge away from humans, and in the Greek tradition, that is just Zeus. But it doesn't stop with Greek mythology. Over in Babylon, the story of Zeus and Prometheus plays out with the well-known figures of Enlil and Enki. In Babylon, the supreme god is Enlil, who, like Zeus, wants to send a flood to destroy the humans. Enki, like Prometheus meanwhile, warns the humans so that they can be saved and start their species over again. Now, over in Rome, instead of claiming ancestry to Zeus or even to Prometheus or Poseidon, they actually claim ancestry to the god Saturn, who in Greece is Kronos, the father of Zeus. Despite that, they still maintain that Saturn was defeated by his son Jupiter, the Roman equivalent to Zeus, and is still the ruler of the world in that pantheon. Now, Zeus and Jupiter don't just share the same story of them overthrowing their father Kronos or Saturn, but they each also have a brother of the sea, Zeus's being Poseidon and Jupiter's being Neptune. Then on the other side, they have a brother of the underworld, with Zeus's brother being known as Hades, and Jupiter's brother of the underworld of course being known as Pluto. It's because of that we know this pantheon even copies over into the ancient Canaanite, the same region that the later Israelite and Jewish people would grow out of. Here, the thunder god is the son of El and is known as Baal, with a brother of the sea named Yam and a brother of the underworld named Mo, explaining why even in the Hebrew Bible that came later, the monotheization of the world religions would still treat this thunder god as the most powerful figure in the lower pantheon. The problem is that in all of these stories, this Zeus figure, this Metatron, is presented as someone who's rather aggressive towards humans, not just sending that great flood, but also trying to keep certain knowledges away from them. This is why, even in the greater Jewish tradition, Metatron isn't treated as the perfect servant of God. In that section from the third book of Enoch that we looked at earlier, Metatron was implied to simply accidentally lead the world into thinking he was the one true God as well. But in later texts like the Jewish Zohar, Metatron is explained as having both good and evil within him. And it's because of that that other parts of the Zohar say the following: "Woe to you, land, when the king is a child." With this being a reference to how Metatron is often called the youth or the lad, as seen in the Book of Enoch, for instance. We have learned that all the lands that belong to nations that worship the stars and constellations are ruled by the governors. And the highest of them all is he of whom it is written, "I have been young and now am old." And we have also learned that this verse was spoken by the governor of the world, namely Metatron, who is called a lad. Woe to the land when the king is a child, woe to the world that draws its nourishment from this aspect, namely the aspect of Metatron. But when Israel is in exile, they draw his nourishment from him, as one who feeds on a stranger, because the children of Israel are supposed to derive their sustenance from the Holy One, blessed be he, and not from Metatron. So as you can see here, the entire world has these stories of this younger god overthrowing an older god and then becoming a very flawed ruler, with the Greek account claiming that Zeus has never actually been able to replicate the golden age that his father Kronos was said to rule over in the great past. And it's because of that a lot of fans believe that this speaker of God figure in Hazbin Hotel isn't actually all that nice. That she's essentially a youth or a child who has been put in charge of the heavens, or isn't really in charge of the heavens at all and has just positioned herself in such a way that everyone thinks she is. The speaker of God may have no idea what's really going on, and even if she is speaking directly to God, he may not be feeding her every piece of the puzzle that she thinks she should have. The same way that the speaker isn't giving Sarah every piece of the puzzle that she has. The speaker of God may essentially be a childlike entity that doesn't understand the consequences of her actions and the effect it has on other people that causes them to suffer. But it's from a lack of sympathy that allows for the extermination of the sinners to eventually lead to one of them, Serpentius, being redeemed and making it into heaven. And that perhaps is the greater goal of God in the Hazbin Hotel universe, placing the speaker of God in the position she is in so that everything can happen exactly in this way and the sinners can eventually be redeemed. Now, thus far, we've discussed the idea that the fruit of forbidden knowledge is the method through which you talk to angels above. But we've also discussed how in the Bible, it very specifically says that you will become like gods, which the later Jewish tradition claims means you will be able to create worlds. What this means, however, is that the figures that we called angels and gods in the various religions are actually none other than ancestor spirits to people alive today. In Hazbin Hotel, the speaker of God is not indicated to ever have had a human life, and instead is just presented as one of the many divine entities that come from above instead of from below. Because the real-life tradition holds this figure to be held by an ancestor spirit, however, Judaism actually maintains that Metatron is none other than one of their own ancestors. This figure being known in the Bible as the great-grandfather of Noah, as well as the descendant of Adam through his third son Seth, who was made to replace Abel. This is the figure known as Enoch, who is the titular character in the first book of Enoch, and who, in the third book of Enoch, Metatron claims to have once been, before becoming this great angel ruling over the heavens. With Metatron being referred to as a youth or a lad, however, the greater Jewish tradition actually maintains that there was an ancient, more primordial Metatron who ruled in this position before Enoch. This makes sense as the books of Enoch aren't just called Enoch because of the name of the ancestor, but Enoch itself translates as teacher or even as initiated, with Enoch himself becoming an angelic initiate who enters the heavens after having his own sort of spiritual rise. Now, in ancient Egypt and all the other cultures in the world, this process of turning your soul into a part of the great ancestor spirits that rule over the world is done with a death and resurrection initiation ceremony. We talked about how in Egypt, for instance, you played the role of Osiris being killed by the god Set, only to be momentarily revived by Isis and thus have a spiritual ascension as the ruler of the underworld. In Judaism, this is actually alluded to in the book of Genesis as well, where there isn't just one Enoch who is a descendant of Seth, but also an Enoch who is the descendant of Cain. Cain, as we said, went on to be the founder of the first city, naming it after his firstborn son, who is in fact the first Enoch, meaning the first initiate. With Cain being a parallel to the Nephilim getting the forbidden knowledge from their angelic fathers, it makes sense that Cain's descendants would be seen as the first initiates, but that later this would go over to the line of Set. This makes extra sense when you consider that the story of Cain and Abel is actually the story of Osiris and Set told in reverse. The story of Osiris and Set is that Osiris, representing Egypt, is killed by Set, representing the god of the desert. In Judaism, that story is reversed. Cain is the first founder of a major city, like Osiris, but he ends up killing Abel, the wandering shepherd of the desert who was replaced by his brother Seth, who historians have often seen as a parallel to the Egyptian Set. What you have then is the same mythic history being shared by the Egyptian sources and the Jewish sources, just told with different metaphors. In the story of Egypt, you have their god Osiris being the ruler until he's overthrown by Set, the god of the Canaanite desert where Judaism would grow out of. Then in Judaism, you have the idea that there was a primordial god or gods ruling over the world until their own ancestor spirit, Enoch, who they now call Metatron, ascended to this throne. This throne is heavily implied in both religions to actually be the sun, with the sun itself being the most important light in our sky, making it perhaps the most important connection for us to God. The Egyptian god Osiris, for instance, actually has his death and resurrection story modeled after the Egyptian sun god Ra, who was said to die each night as the sun set and he fell into the underworld before rising again the next morning after being victorious against the evil forces there. It's because of this similarity that at certain times in Egyptian history, they were actually referred to as one god as Ra Osiris. In Judaism, meanwhile, Enoch is constantly equated with the sun. In the canonical book of Genesis, for instance, in the one anecdote that we get about Enoch, it's explained that he actually only lived for 365 years before being taken up to be with God. This is different from all the other patriarchs in the genealogy that surrounds his mention, where they are listed as having much longer lives and are said to have died at the end of their reigns instead of being taken by God. And it's at that point of living 365 years, the same number of days it takes to go around the sun, that Enoch is said to ascend to the role of Metatron and sit on the throne just beside God. Even Hazbin Hotel alludes to this symbolism with the speaker of God, with the room of the speaker being decorated to look like the sun is shining at the very center. When the speaker does enter the room, she comes from above, where the sun's light is shining from, and when asking for guidance from God, the speaker informs Sarah that this is a light that they cannot provide her. The big difference in Hazbin Hotel, however, is that the speaker of God seems to be the only person to ever hold this role in the history of its universe. Whereas in real life, the primordial Metatron who would have sat on this throne before is the figure we would think of today as Lucifer, the figure who was once a favored angel of God, but who was said to fall to the earth because of their rebellion and sins. In Hazbin Hotel, however, it's the speaker of God who's treated as a much older angel, and Lucifer who's treated as a younger angel who made some foolish mistakes and fell out of heaven. But even with that in mind, it's hard not to think that season 3 or perhaps even season 4 will focus on the idea that the speaker of God is not everything she says she is. While there doesn't seem to be some succession of rulers before the speaker, her story still seems to be that she can mislead the world based on what she represents as her ruling and God's ruling, and there is a lot of interesting ways that could go with the lore we have here, as well as the creativity of Vivziepop and her writing team. But to start, we can find some of the ideas in the esoteric stories of redemption. Part 5, Gnosticism. When it comes to how the show will end, I think that regardless of what new big plot elements they bring into the story, the key theme will still be the same. That of Charlie, the extension of Lucifer himself, finding ways to redeem people that can help them ascend. This isn't a surprising turn of events, considering that is essentially the story of Jesus Christ. For those who don't know, the claim of Jesus was that humans as a whole were being kept out of heaven by the prince of the world, the ancestor of the Pharisees. For those who don't know, in the New Testament, Jesus claimed that the Satan is none other than the prince of this world, the figure that we would also call Metatron, who the Jewish people refer to as the flawed ruler. Charlie, like Jesus, has to become a self-sacrificing figure in order to help those around her get into heaven. Where Hazbin Hotel gets interesting is making this fate of the daughter of Lucifer, the fallen angel. But once again, in the esoteric tradition, this equation of Charlie and Lucifer with Jesus actually makes sense. One thing a lot of you probably noticed over the course of this video is that the Fruit of Forbidden Knowledge involves a ritual that generally showcases a death and resurrection, and it's no secret that this is the basic story of Jesus Christ himself. For those not in the loop, Christianity is really about Jesus coming to the earth to die for our sins after being betrayed by Judas and killed on the cross. For 3 days, Jesus is said to die and even descend into the spiritual world, where his sacrifice enables him to erase the debt of sin for all humans who invoke his name, and even the spirits in a tortured state after death. This matches the death and resurrection ceremonies of the mystery school tradition, which don't just connect you to your ancestor spirit, but were said to wipe away your sins for the initiate. This is the teaching that Judaism claims to be passed down from Samael or Lucifer, but certain mystery schools actually equate this figure directly with Jesus. This is the case with Gnosticism, a mystery school movement from the early centuries of Christianity found throughout the Hellenistic world where Christianity itself was spreading. Gnosticism is believed to have evolved out of the existing mystery schools that were popular in Greece, such as the Eleusinian Mysteries, but with the adoption of Christian symbols to tell their stories in a way relatable to the New Age. In Gnostic texts, the Old Testament stories are rewritten so that the Old Testament God tries to trap people within the earth, instead of letting them go to the heavenly higher realms. The primeval Genesis stories about Adam and Eve and up through the flood are retold with the idea that the Old Testament God is some sort of villain. This isn't done to demonize the one true God of the Jewish religion, however, as, like with Judaism, they hold the Old Testament God and the one true God to sometimes be separate entities. With Gnosticism having its root in Greek mystery schools, a lot of their retelling of Genesis actually just recast the Old Testament God as none other than Zeus, who in their own mythology was said to do the same things as the Old Testament God, such as sending the Great Flood and keeping forbidden knowledge from humans. This figure is shown in Gnostic texts as trying to present itself as the one true God and not being able to conceive of the greater gods above him. In the Greek version of the Forbidden Knowledge stories, it's Zeus who kept the knowledge away from humans and Prometheus who gave it to them. But in the Gnostic retellings of these stories, it's actually Jesus who gives this knowledge to the humans in the Garden of Eden. Here in the Apocryphon of John, Jesus is explaining to John that he is the one that gave the fruit to Adam and Eve for them to eat, with John playing the part of the audience member and saying that he was taught that it was the serpent who convinced the humans to eat the fruit. Furthermore, other texts like Pistis Sophia explain that Jesus came down in 3 forms. First as the serpent to give us knowledge, or Prometheus in the Greek tradition. Then again later as the figure we call Noah, or who the Greeks called Deucalion, in order to save humanity from the Great Flood. In the Greek tradition, this Deucalion is actually none other than the son of Prometheus himself. Finally, the 3rd time Jesus would come down would be in the form of Jesus himself, this time to save humanity from their sins and to prepare himself for the ultimate ascension to godhood. The Christian account of this, of course, is in the well-known Gospels of the New Testament, but even Judaism references this several times in their writings, such as in the Talmud here, where you can read that Jesus of Nazarene was executed on Passover for misleading the world. In some cases, people will try to claim that this is a different Jesus of Nazarene who misled the world and was killed on Passover, unrelated to the Christian one. However, later Jewish texts like the Toledot of Yeshua tell the story again of a more villainous Jesus misleading the world and having to be killed thanks to none other than Judas Iscariot. Clearly the same story of Jesus' betrayal by Judas Iscariot in the Bible. This, at least by proxy, explains some of the inspiration for the characterization of Lucifer in Hazbin Hotel, where he's presented as being well-meaning from the very beginning. In Charlie's story, he was described as a fun-loving angel who wanted existence to be a celebration, and that is why he tried to give humans the forbidden knowledge that the other gods of heaven didn't want them to have. Like Jesus, Lucifer has to descend to hell, where an extension of him, his own daughter, would seek to redeem the souls that had already passed away. Meanwhile, it's not just Sarah or heaven as a whole keeping out the sinners, but specifically the Speaker of God, the one claiming that this is the plan God wanted, the parallel to the Gnostic demiurge and the Kabbalistic figure Metatron. All of this hints to me not just at Charlie finding a way to redeem the world, but actually being the true inheritor of Lilith's legacy to retake heaven. While Vox and Charlie both claim their goals are inspired by Lilith, Vox's goals are for himself, while Charlie's goals are for the people. It doesn't really matter what Lilith's original goal was, because with Charlie's good intentions, she has the potential to actually ascend and become the new ruler over creation one day. I wouldn't be surprised if the series ended with Charlie not just being the Queen of Hell, but Queen of Heaven as well, and her being left in charge with no Sarah or Speaker of God there to lead her in the wrong direction. I think this was hinted at greatly in season 1 when we see Charlie trying to visit her father Lucifer as a child. In his room, he's working on some sort of special project that creates the illusion of a duck, a baby duckling just like Charlie is. In a beautiful transformation, however, the duck becomes not just some big, beautiful older duck, but a phoenix-looking figure rising upwards. The phoenix is an important figure in death and resurrection, with the story being that a phoenix burns in fire when it reaches an old age, but it's reborn again as the baby rises from the ashes. With the phoenix story itself also being tied to that of the sun dying every night and rising again in the morning. A lot of people have pointed to the idea that the Speaker of God as some sort of sun-based bird is something of a phoenix herself. But to me, all of this symbolism isn't alluding to the Speaker of God eventually being redeemed and maintaining her role, but the idea that Charlie herself is just a baby duckling who's going to rise into something like a phoenix, becoming the new ruler of heaven, hell, and creation, all as part of the one true God's ultimate plan that could only have been done if Lucifer had seemingly rebelled. In the end, it won't be Charlie alone, however, which is something we already saw at the end of season 2. Here, it wasn't even Charlie that tried to first get up and sacrifice herself to save everyone, but instead it was Emily, with Charlie joining in to give her more strength. And because of this, the most powerful entities in hell were motivated to put their resources towards saving everyone instead of enslaving them, even if only for a minute. This plays into the idea that coming together itself isn't an affront to God. He does want us to unite, and he did allow us to receive the forbidden knowledge that can bring us all together with its advancements in technology. But he wants this done with us working together for the betterment of all, not the misleading of the world for the glorification of the few. And those will inevitably be struck down. Vox tried to rise as this figure with his secret society symbolism, the advancements in technology his group helped spread around the world and even hell, calling himself the Flood to represent the Nephilim before the flood, while standing in front of his Leviathan-looking sea monster, often used to represent those ancient pre-flood cultures, and of course, calling himself the Omega, or the End, while posing like some sort of six-winged seraphim. Even the reprise of his song, Vox Populi, is just called Vox Dei, which translates as Vox or Voice, God of Gods. But of course, any attempt to raise yourself to this position because of pride will just have you being shot down by God's ultimate plan. And one way or another, this is where the show is going to continue to go as it explores its new villains. But for more information on what those new villains might be as the series progresses, make sure you subscribe, as we're going to have a lot of Hazbin Hotel videos coming out this week talking about the finale, including my theories on how Valentino is going to become a much bigger villain in season 3 of this show, as well as how seasons 3 and 4 will probably get into the stories of Ru, maybe the root of all evil, as well as the gods of light and dark that we saw back in season 1. If you want more mythological breakdowns like this, make sure you don't just subscribe to the channel, but use that join button next to the subscribe button in order to sign up for our early access membership club. This gives you early access to any video we can put out early there, as well as this bigger lecture series I'm putting together about mythology in Hazbin Hotel and animation in general. Links as always will be in the pinned comment down below. If you want more mythology outside of Hazbin Hotel, be sure to check out our big mythology playlist getting into all of these different shows that we've talked about, including season 1 of Hazbin Hotel. And finally, I really want to thank my editor Haro for his hard work on this video. Haro is the one who edits most of the videos you see here on Cartoon Universe, and whenever we do a really big video like this, I want to take the time to say thank you, because without him, this just simply wouldn't be possible. Let me know if you have any questions about esoterica or cartoons in the the comments down below, and I'll see you guys next time.